The decision arrives through encrypted astropathic transmission, a death sentence rendered in high Gothic script across parchment sealed with the inquisitorial rosette. Hive Mordaxis, population 63 billion souls, has been deemed irredeemable. The contamination spreading through its lower levels cannot be contained by conventional means. The taint must be purged absolutely, completely, permanently. Exterminatus protocols will commence in 72 standard hours. Governor Militant Castaigne receives the pronouncement in his palace atop Spire Primus, 30 kilometers above the ash wastes that surround the hive. Through armor-glass windows thick enough to withstand orbital debris, he watches the morning shift change as billions of workers flow through the transportation arterials like blood through veins. They do not yet know their world ends soon. They continue their routines because routine is all most hivers understand. Wake, work, eat recycled protein paste, sleep in hab units barely larger than coffins, repeat until death claims them through industrial accident, gang violence, or simple exhaustion. Now death comes for them all at once, democratic in its totality. The Inquisitor who delivered the pronouncement stands beside Castaigne, her face hidden behind a rebreather mask decorated with devotional scripture. She explains the situation with clinical precision. 4 months prior, Adeptus Arbites enforcers investigating unusual murder patterns in the Underhive discovered something that should not exist. A Genestealer cult had established itself in the abandoned manufactories of Sub-Level 847, spreading its Xenos taint through the desperate populations that scratched out existence in those forsaken depths. By the time the Arbits realized the scope of the infestation, the cult numbered in the millions. Its fourth-generation hybrids had infiltrated the planetary defense forces, the administratum, even the nobility. The psychic beacon calling to the Hive fleet burns bright enough now to be detected across several systems. Containment failed 3 weeks ago. A purge operation involving 2 regiments of Mordian Iron Guard and a full precinct fortress worth of Arbits succeeded only in driving the cultists deeper into the Hive's labyrinthine structure. They now control everything below level 200, approximately 40% of the Hive's total volume, and home to perhaps 20 billion people. The taint spreads upward like rising water, inexorable and unstoppable. Eliminating the cult conventionally would require tearing apart the Hive level by level, a process that would take years and cost more resources than the Imperium can spare. The strategic calculus proves simple and brutal. 63 billion lives weigh less than the threat of a Tyranid Hive fleet using Mordaxis as a beacon to invade the entire sector. Castaigne does not argue. He cannot. The Inquisitor possesses absolute authority in such matters, backed by millennia of precedent, and the full weight of imperial law. To question Exterminatus once declared Court's execution as heresy. Instead, he asks the only question that matters now. How many can be evacuated? The Inquisitor's expression remains unreadable behind her mask, but her pause before answering speaks volumes. The orbital facilities can handle perhaps 3 million refugees if we commandeer every civilian vessel in system. Castaigne stares at the sprawling cityscape below. 3 million from 63 billion. A rounding error, less than 0.05%, meaningless in the face of such totality. The first 12 hours after the pronouncement pass in carefully orchestrated silence. The Inquisitor insists on this. Premature announcement would trigger planetary-scale panic, making evacuation of even that pitiful 3 million impossible. So Castaigne maintains normal operations while quietly issuing orders to his inner circle. Administrators receive coded messages to begin transferring critical data archives to orbital storage. Military officers learn their units will be redeploying off-world for immediate reassignment. Industrial overseers get instructions to ship their most valuable equipment and technical staff to the orbital docks under the guise of routine supply runs. Each order comes with implicit understanding that mentioning the true reason means summary execution. The noble houses occupying the Hive spires react to the whispered warnings with practiced efficiency. Centuries of backstabbing and political maneuvering have taught them to recognize existential threats and respond decisively. Private yachts and family transports receive priority docking clearances. Personal guard units mobilize to secure routes to the orbital elevators. Favored servants, valuable technicians and loyal retainers receive rushed notifications to gather essential possessions. Most nobles feel no obligation to warn the broader population. The masses exist to serve. When service becomes impossible, they cease to matter. A few experience something approaching guilt, manifesting as generous final donations to ecclesiarchy charities, or sudden interest in ensuring their household staff receives evacuation priority. But these gestures remain tokens, drops of mercy in an ocean of indifference. Hour 13 brings the first widespread awareness that something catastrophic approaches. Too many spacecraft lifting off simultaneously, too many high-ranking officials abandoning their posts, too many Arbeits units receiving redeployment orders. The patterns become obvious to anyone paying attention, and in a Hive city, millions pay very close attention to any deviation from routine because survival often depends on recognizing threats early. Vox networks crackle with speculation. Data terminals display queries about unusual military movements. Street preachers begin warning that the Emperor's judgment approaches. The rumour spreads through the middle Hive like fire through Promethium. Fumes, each retelling adding new details, most of them wrong, all of them terrifying. The Governor Militant makes his official announcement at hour 18, hoping to control the narrative before it spirals completely beyond management. Standing before picked recorders that will broadcast his image to every functioning display screen in the Hive, Castaigne delivers the news with military precision. Hive Mordaxis has been compromised by Xenos corruption that threatens the entire sector. The Imperium has decreed that the world must be cleansed. Evacuation procedures are in effect for all citizens. Priority will be given to those with critical skills and Imperial service records. Remain calm, maintain order, await further instructions. The announcement triggers precisely the panic it was meant to prevent. Tens of billions suddenly understand they face death, not from the distant abstraction of Xenos invasion, but from their own government's deliberate action. The distinction between those marked for evacuation and those condemned to die becomes the only fact that matters. Middle Hive residents pour into the streets, overwhelming transportation systems as they attempt to reach the orbital elevators. Hab blocks empty as entire communities mobilize, dragging whatever possessions they can carry, heading toward imagined safety. The transit arterials designed to handle shift changes for millions strain under the weight of billions moving simultaneously in one direction. Violence erupts within hours. At every checkpoint, every way station, every bottleneck, the crowds press forward while guards attempt to impose order through increasingly desperate measures. The Arbeits fire into crowds when pushed too hard, killing hundreds to create temporary space, but the press of bodies behind fills every gap immediately. Citizens turn on each other, fighting for position in queues that lead nowhere. Parents abandon children when the choice becomes carrying an infant or pushing through to the next transit level. The elderly and infirm get trampled underfoot, their bodies adding to the obstacles blocking passages already too narrow for the flood of humanity trying to force through them. The Genestealer cult recognizes opportunity in the chaos. While PDF forces redeploy to manage the evacuation crisis, cultist cells emerge from the lower levels, moving upward through sectors suddenly stripped of military presence. They do not attack openly. Instead, they spread through the crowds, whispering that the Imperium has betrayed its people, that the Star Children offer true salvation, that the Patriarch promises transformation rather than death. Many desperate souls, facing certain doom and seeing no other path, accept the cult's embrace. The infection spreads faster in these final hours than it did during months of careful infiltration. In the Underhive, populations that have never known Imperial authority respond to the crisis with savage pragmatism. Gang structures optimize, instantly for survival. The strongest warlords consolidate power, promising followers access to deep shelters in exchange for absolute obedience. Ancient vault doors leading into the most reinforced sections of the Hive's foundation become worth dying to control. Battles rage in absolute darkness as desperate humans slaughter each other for the chance to hide in toxic sumps, where slow death by radiation poisoning beats immediate vaporization. These Underhivers understand intuitively what Middle Hive citizens refuse to accept. When destruction comes from above, the only possible survival lies in going deeper, hiding in places so thoroughly poisoned that perhaps even Exterminatus-grade weapons cannot reach. The tech priests maintaining the Hive's essential systems face their own theological crisis. Their creed revolves around preserving sacred technology, venerating the machine spirits that inhabit every system. To abandon these ancient devices to destruction contradicts everything they believe. Some refuse to leave, continuing maintenance rituals right up until annihilation. They chant litanies to calm machine spirits as the world falls apart, their final prayers offered not for themselves, but for the technological marvels they cannot save. Others desperately attempt data preservation, uploading schematics and operational parameters into portable cogitators, hoping to save fragments of knowledge even if the physical machines perish. By hour 36, the evacuation efforts have devolved into triage. The 3 million slots promised by the Inquisitor prove optimistic. Spacecraft designed for cargo get hastily modified to carry passengers crammed into every available space. Life support systems strain under loads they were never meant to handle. Ships rated for 300 passengers accept 3,000, creating conditions where many will suffocate or die from exposure during transit. But at least they will die in space rather than on the condemned world below. The selection process for evacuation becomes increasingly arbitrary. Noble families and their retinues claim the majority of berths. Military personnel with specialized skills receive priority. Adeptus Mechanicus, adepts whose knowledge cannot be easily replaced, get allocated spaces. Everyone else faces a lottery system that is neither fair nor random, determined by factors ranging from administrative clerical errors to which petty official controls access to which boarding areas. Hour 48 marks the arrival of the Exterminatus fleet. 6 Imperial Navy vessels translate from warp space at the system's edge, their massive forms displacing reality as they force themselves back into normal space. The lead vessel, a Retribution-class battleship named Eternal Resolve, carries the torpedoes that will end Mordaxis. The fleet maintains a holding position beyond the planet's orbit, allowing evacuation efforts to continue while making clear through their mere presence that time grows short. Crew aboard those warships prepare weapons they pray never to use, checking and rechecking systems that will unleash destruction on a scale most human minds cannot properly grasp. The sight of the Exterminatus fleet breaks something fundamental in the Hive population's collective psychology. The knowledge that death has been pronounced is one thing. Seeing the instruments of that death hanging in the sky transforms abstract horror into visceral terror. Suicides spike dramatically as individuals choose quick deaths on their own terms rather than waiting for what comes. Entire families gather in hab units and activate gas valves, preferring chemical unconsciousness to the alternatives. Others leap from hab block edges, their bodies falling kilometers to splatter against lower-level structures. These deaths number in the hundreds of thousands, statistically insignificant against the Hive's total population but representing individual choices to maintain some final scrap of dignity or control. Religious fervour reaches apocalyptic intensity. The ecclesiarchy temples overflow with penitents seeking absolution for sins they believe earned divine punishment. Preachers declare that Mordaxis failed the Emperor, that insufficient faith brought this judgment, that only through confession and prayer might individual souls achieve salvation even if bodies must perish. Other sects preach different interpretations. Some declare the Exterminatus a test, insisting that true believers will be miraculously preserved while the faithless burn. Others embrace annihilation as holy martyrdom, claiming that dying for the Emperor grants automatic ascension to his side. These competing theologies spark violence as different apocalyptic cults battle for dominance, each convinced their framework provides the only correct response to doom. The final 24 hours see the complete breakdown of any pretense of organised evacuation. The orbital facilities have reached maximum capacity. The last spacecraft capable of achieving escape velocity have launched, their cargo holds crammed with refugees far beyond safety limits. Perhaps 4 million souls have escaped. 59 billion remain, trapped on a world that ends soon. The Governor Militant takes the last transport off Mordaxis, his duty to the Imperium demanding he preserve himself and his knowledge for future service. The Inquisitor departs aboard her personal vessel, satisfied that proper protocols have been followed. The highest-ranking authorities abandon the world they condemned, leaving those below to face consequences of decisions they had no voice in making. In the Hive's final hours, strange transformations occur among those who remain. Some populations achieve a kind of fatalistic calm, gathering in communal spaces to share final meals, tell stories, maintain human connection until the end. Others descend into hedonistic abandon, indulging every suppressed desire now that consequences have lost all meaning. Violence perpetrated for violence's sake becomes common as individuals who lived constrained lives suddenly recognize no authority remains to punish them. The Arbites who stayed behind either enforce order through overwhelming brutality or join the lawlessness, becoming the very criminals they once hunted. The Genestealer cult makes its final move in Hour 71. With Imperial forces departed and resistance collapsed, cult members emerge openly, their hybrid forms no longer hidden. They spread through the upper levels, promising transformation, offering purpose to those who see only death ahead. Thousands accept the cult's embrace in these final moments, allowing the Genestealer kiss to infect them, choosing mutation over extinction. The Patriarch broadcasts its psychic call across all frequencies, a wordless scream of joy and hunger that reaches toward the stars, beckoning the Hive fleet closer, marking this world as ready for consumption. At Hour 72, the Eternal Resolve achieves optimal firing position. Its captain, a veteran of 30 years void service who has witnessed horrors beyond counting, gives the order with a voice that barely trembles. 6 cyclonic torpedoes launch from their tubes, trailing fire as they drop toward Mordaxis. Each warhead contains enough destructive power to crack a continent. Together, they carry the capacity to ignite an entire atmosphere. The weapons cross the distance between orbital space and planetary surface in minutes that feel like hours. Groundside populations have time to look up, to see streaks of light growing brighter, to understand that the final moment has arrived. The first torpedo impacts near Hive Mordaxis' equatorial regions. The explosion releases energy equivalent to thousands of thermonuclear weapons detonating simultaneously, creating a fireball visible from orbit. The shockwave radiates outward at speeds exceeding sound, flattening everything in its path. The Hive's lower levels vaporize instantly, their structures unable to withstand such forces. Middle levels collapse as foundations disappear, sending trillions of tons of rockcrete and metal cascading downward. The upper spires, those elegant towers where nobility lived just days before, topple like fallen trees, their ruins scattering across kilometers of devastation. The remaining torpedoes strike at calculated intervals, their impacts distributed across the planet to ensure complete coverage. Each detonation adds to the catastrophic chain reaction already underway. The atmosphere ignites as temperatures reach levels that turn air itself into fuel. Firestorms sweep across continents, consuming everything that survived the initial blasts. The planet's crust cracks under the strain, releasing magma from below to mix with the burning atmosphere above. Mordaxis transforms from a functioning world into a hellscape of fire and molten rock, its biosphere obliterated in minutes. Deep beneath what was once Hive, Mordaxis, in those toxic sumps where the most desperate sought shelter, the underhivers who chose that path meet their end. The reinforced vaults they fought so hard to control prove insufficient against weapons designed to crack planets. Some die instantly as shockwaves pulverize their shelters. Others survive the initial destruction only to face slow death as temperatures rise beyond what human flesh can endure, the very air they breathe superheating until lungs blister and cook from within. Their final moments offer no dignity, no meaning, just pain and terror in absolute darkness. The Genestealer cultists die alongside those they infected, their dreams of ascension and transformation reduced to the same charred remains as everyone else. The Patriarch's psychic scream cuts off abruptly as its alien biology fails, its final broadcast reaching the distant Hive fleet with a message of death rather than invitation. 63 billion human souls cease to exist within the span of a single hour. Their lives, hopes, fears, loves, and hatreds, all rendered meaningless by strategic necessity. The manufactorums they laboured in for generations dissolve into slag. The hab blocks where families live for centuries collapse into rubble. The temples where they worshipped the Emperor become pyres that leave no ash. Everything that made Mordaxis a living world burns away, leaving behind a dead rock that will remain too hostile for human habitation for millennia. Aboard the Eternal Resolve, the captain orders his fleet to hold position above the still-burning world, ensuring the destruction proceeds completely. He will write his report according to standard Exterminatus protocols, documenting the threat eliminated and the cost paid. The Inquisitor who authorized this action will note it in her records, one more world purged of the Xenos taint, one more necessary sacrifice for the Imperium's survival. The Governor Militant will receive a new posting, his administrative skills too valuable to waste despite the loss of his former domain. Life continues throughout the Imperium even as Mordaxis dies. Other Hive worlds produce their quotas. Other populations labour in the Emperor's name. Other worlds face their own threats and crises. The death of one Hive city barely registers against the vast scale of humanity's galactic empire. But those 4 million who escaped carry memories they cannot forget, nightmares of the world they left behind, guilt for surviving when so many did not. In the centuries to come, Mordaxis will serve as cautionary tale and grim reminder. New recruits to the Inquisition study it as an example of proper threat assessment and decisive action. Military academies include it in their curricula on the consequences of Xenos infiltration. Ecclesiarchy preachers invoke it when demanding vigilance against corruption. The name Mordaxis becomes shorthand for necessary sacrifice, for the brutal calculus that values the Imperium's survival above any individual world. But the specific details fade. The names of the Governor Militant and the Inquisitor who authorized the purge disappear into archival records few will ever read. The 63 billion dead become a statistic rather than individuals. Their suffering, their final moments of terror, their desperate attempts at survival, all compress into a single sentence in historical texts. Hive Mordaxis, condemned for Xenos corruption, cleansed via Exterminatus, 72 standard hours from pronouncement to completion. Efficient, necessary, regrettable, but ultimately justified. This represents the Imperium's ultimate horror. Not that such destruction occurs, but that it occurs so routinely it demands no particular explanation or justification beyond the simple declaration that it was required. 63 billion souls, and in the grand accounting of humanity's survival, they matter less than the resources spent to eliminate them. The aftermath of Exterminatus extends far beyond the physical destruction of a world. Those who survive through evacuation carry psychological wounds that never fully heal. The guilt of survival itself becomes a form of torture, manifesting in patterns recognizable across thousands of Exterminatus survivors documented throughout Imperial history. These refugees understand on a visceral level that their continued existence came at the cost of billions who perished. The randomness of their selection for evacuation strips away any pretense that merit or virtue determined survival. They lived because a clerical error placed their name on a manifest, because they happened to work in a sector with access to evacuation routes, because they possessed some technical skill deemed valuable enough to preserve. Their neighbours, friends, family members who lacked these arbitrary advantages burned with everyone else. The Ecclesiarchy attempts to provide theological frameworks for processing this trauma, but the comfort offered rings hollow to most survivors. Preachers explain that those who escaped did so through the Emperor's will, that divine providence selected them for survival to serve some greater purpose. But survivors know the truth of their salvation. They remember pushing past others in evacuation queues. They recall seeing children trampled while they stepped over bodies to reach boarding ramps. They understand that nothing divine determined their fate, only the brutal mathematics of limited space and overwhelming demand. This knowledge corrodes faith from within. Some survivors abandon religious practice entirely, unable to reconcile the Ecclesiarchy's pronouncements about the Emperor's love with the reality of watching worlds burn. Others plunge deeper into zealotry, seeking meaning through ever more extreme expressions of devotion, hoping that sufficient faith might retroactively justify their survival. The practical challenges facing Exterminatus refugees compound their psychological distress. The Imperium possesses no infrastructure specifically designed to handle the sudden displacement of millions from a destroyed world. These survivors become administrative problems to be managed rather than people requiring care. They get dispersed across whatever worlds possess capacity to absorb additional population, assigned to whatever labour shortages exist in those locations. A noble who once commanded thousands of servants might find himself working assembly lines in a manufactorum on some distant Hive world. A skilled artisan who spent decades perfecting her craft gets reassigned to mining operations where her expertise means nothing. The Imperium recognizes no obligation to preserve pre-Exterminatus social structures or honor previous positions. Survival grants no privileges, only continued existence to serve the Emperor in whatever capacity proves necessary. Many Exterminatus refugees never psychologically recover from their trauma. Suicide rates among this population exceed standard Imperial civilian averages by significant margins. Some survivors end their lives immediately upon reaching their relocation destinations, unable to bear the weight of guilt and displacement. Others endure for years before finally succumbing, their will to continue gradually eroding under the accumulated stress of starting over in unfamiliar environments, while haunted by memories of the billions who died. The Imperium treats these deaths with indifference. Each refugee represents a recovered resource, a labour unit salvaged from planetary destruction. If some percentage of those units self-terminate, this merely reduces the burden on relocation systems while the remainder continue producing value through their work. Children who survived Exterminatus face particular psychological burdens. They carry memories of watching their worlds die during their formative years, trauma that shapes their entire developmental trajectory. Many display severe behavioural disturbances, manifesting as either extreme withdrawal or violent acting out. The Imperium possesses limited interest in providing therapeutic support for damaged youth. These children either adapt to their new circumstances through sheer resilience, or fail to function adequately and get filtered into the most expendable labour assignments, where their psychological instability matters less than their capacity for basic physical work. Some evacuee children develop obsessive fixations on the Exterminatus that destroyed their homes, compulsively studying the theological and strategic justifications, trying to impose rational frameworks on experiences that defy comprehension. Others adopt complete amnesia about their origins, claiming to have always lived in their relocation sites, constructing false memories that allow them to function without confronting the truth of what they survived. The Inquisitors who authorize Exterminatus actions develop their own psychological adaptations to the weight of their decisions. To order, the death of billions requires either complete moral certainty about the necessity of such destruction, or a carefully cultivated emotional detachment that treats human life as mere numbers in strategic calculations. Most Inquisitors who regularly employ Exterminatus protocols lean toward the latter approach. They train themselves to view populations as abstractions rather than collections of individuals. A hive city becomes a strategic asset that either serves Imperial interests or poses sufficient threat to warrant elimination. The billions living in that hive exist only as a single data point in threat assessment algorithms. Whether those billions live or die matters solely insofar as their existence impacts broader strategic concerns. This psychological distancing serves as a survival mechanism for Inquisitors. To feel the full emotional weight of destroying entire worlds would rapidly lead to madness or paralysis. An Inquisitor who allowed himself to contemplate the individual lives ended by his orders, to imagine the terror of populations facing annihilation, to carry genuine guilt for the deaths he causes, would quickly lose the capacity to function in his role. The Inquisition requires ruthless pragmatism from its members precisely because the decisions they must make prove too psychologically devastating for anyone retaining normal human empathy. Those who cannot master this emotional detachment either wash out of the Inquisition early in their careers or suffer catastrophic psychological breaks that remove them from active service. Some Inquisitors cope with the psychological burden of Exterminatus through elaborate self-justification narratives. They construct theological frameworks declaring that the Emperor personally guides their decisions, that every world they destroy falls because divine will demands it. This allows them to displace responsibility from their individual choices onto a higher power. They become instruments of divine judgment rather than people making horrific decisions. Other Inquisitors embrace a darker philosophy, acknowledging that Exterminatus represents murder on a scale almost impossible to comprehend, but declaring such murder necessary for humanity's survival. They accept damnation for their actions, believing their souls forfeit as the price for preserving the Imperium. These Inquisitors often describe themselves as already damned, doomed to suffer eternal punishment for their crimes, but willing to bear that fate if it means the Imperium endures. The Imperial Navy personnel who physically execute Exterminatus orders face different psychological challenges than the Inquisitors who authorize them. Ship captains who launch cyclonic torpedoes or release virus bombs carry out mass destruction without the authority to question whether such destruction is warranted. They simply receive orders through proper chains of command and implement those orders with professional efficiency. This creates a psychological distance between action and responsibility. The captain who fires the torpedoes that ignite a planetary atmosphere did not decide that worlds should die. He merely executed commands from legitimate authority. This separation of decision from action allows Navy personnel to avoid the worst psychological impacts of Exterminatus participation. However, actually witnessing planetary destruction affects even the most hardened void warfare veterans. The sheer scale of devastation visible from orbital positions as continents burn and atmospheres ignite proves difficult to process. Many crew members assigned to Exterminatus operations develop coping mechanisms similar to those employed by Inquisitors. They focus on technical details of weapon deployment, treating the destruction below as an engineering problem requiring precise execution rather than a moral catastrophe. Others simply refuse to look, remaining at their stations but never glancing at viewing screens showing the world dying beneath them. Some crews develop grim rituals around Exterminatus duty, holding memorial services for the populations they destroyed, acknowledging the horror of what they have done while insisting it remained necessary. The theological implications of Exterminatus pose significant challenges for the ecclesiarchy. On one level, the practice fits perfectly within imperial cult doctrine. The Emperor's will supersedes all other concerns. If destroying a world serves the Imperium, then such destruction becomes holy regardless of the death toll. Preachers regularly invoke Exterminatus as proof of the Emperor's judgment, declaring that corrupted worlds deserve annihilation, and that the righteous have no cause to mourn those who fell into heresy. But this theology creates uncomfortable questions about divine justice and human suffering that the ecclesiarchy would prefer to avoid. If the Emperor truly protects humanity, why do billions of faithful imperial citizens die during Exterminatus actions? The standard response claims that Xenos corruption, or chaos taint, spreads through populations until distinguishing the innocent from the guilty becomes impossible. Therefore all must perish to ensure the threat's complete elimination. But this explanation satisfies no one who witnessed their faithful neighbours, colleagues, and family members burning alongside actual cultists. The survivors know that vast majorities of Exterminatus victims remained loyal to the Emperor until their final moments, that heresy or alien taint infected only small percentages of condemned populations. The indiscriminate slaughter required by Exterminatus contradicts theological assurances about the Emperor's love for his faithful servants. The ecclesiarchy handles these contradictions through strategic silence. Preachers avoid detailed discussions of Exterminatus theology, instead offering generalized platitudes about sacrifice and duty when forced to address the topic. The official position maintains that questioning Exterminatus demonstrates insufficient faith, that true believers accept the Emperor's judgment without demanding explanation. Anyone who presses too hard for theological justification risks investigation for heresy, the implication being that only someone sympathetic to Xenos or Chaos would object to eliminating corrupted worlds. This circular logic forecloses most theological debate, forcing doubts about Exterminatus into private contemplation rather than public discussion. Some heterodox imperial sects develop alternative theological frameworks around Exterminatus. These minority traditions propose that the Emperor sorrows at the necessity of destroying worlds, that each Exterminatus breaks his heart but remains unavoidable given the threats facing humanity. This theology casts the Emperor as a tragic figure forced into horrific actions by circumstances beyond even his control, suffering alongside those who die by his judgment. The ecclesiarchy officially condemns such interpretations as heretical, insisting that the Emperor's will proceeds from perfect wisdom rather than tragic necessity. Acknowledging that the Emperor might feel regret or sorrow implies imperfection, suggesting that alternative choices might exist. The Imperium cannot permit such speculation because it might lead to questioning whether specific Exterminatus actions were truly necessary. The long-term strategic implications of Exterminatus shape imperial military and political calculations in subtle ways. Every world destroyed represents resources permanently removed from the Imperium's tithe system. The manufactorums that produced weapons and equipment no longer function. The populations that provided recruits for the Imperial Guard no longer exist. The food supplies that sustained other worlds in the sector stop flowing. Exterminatus solves immediate threats but creates supply chain disruptions that ripple across entire subsectors for decades. The Imperium's economy operates at such vast scales that losing individual worlds barely registers in sector-wide calculations, but the accumulated losses from centuries of Exterminatus actions subtract significant capacity from Imperial capabilities. This economic reality places practical limits on Exterminatus deployment despite its nominal status as a last resort measure. Inquisitors who order planetary destruction too readily face censure not for moral failings, but for wasteful resource destruction. The Imperium accepts that sometimes eliminating corruption requires sacrificing productive worlds, but it expects inquisitorial judgment to distinguish genuinely unrecoverable situations from those where conventional reconquest remains viable. An Inquisitor who destroys a Forge world producing critical military equipment because he detected minor Chaos cult activity in one Hive city demonstrates poor judgment, regardless of whether that cult posed genuine long-term threat. The strategic value of the Forge worlds, production outweighs the risk of cult infiltration unless that infiltration has progressed far beyond containment. The calculus grows even more complex for Hive worlds. These planets support such enormous populations that even small evacuation percentages salvage millions of potential workers and soldiers. The administrative apparatus required to process millions of refugees strains Imperial logistics, but those refugees represent future production capacity once relocated to new worlds. An Inquisitor contemplating Exterminatus on a Hive world must weigh the costs of evacuation against the strategic value of recovered population. If circumstances permit extracting even 5% of a Hive city's inhabitants before destruction, those millions serve the Imperium better than dying with their world. But extended evacuation operations provide additional time for whatever corruption necessitated Exterminatus to spread, potentially compromising evacuated populations or allowing contamination to spread to evacuation craft themselves. These strategic considerations mean that Exterminatus decisions rarely follow simple threat assessment. Military leaders, administratum officials, Mechanicus Forge masters, and other interested parties all provide input about whether a threatened world's strategic value justifies the costs of conventional reconquest versus immediate destruction. The Inquisitor holds ultimate authority to order Exterminatus regardless of other opinions, but practical politics mean that an Inquisitor who consistently overrules strategic concerns faces increasing resistance from other Imperial institutions. Eventually, that Inquisitor may find his orders questioned or delayed, his authority undermined through bureaucratic obstruction, even though nominally no one possesses the right to countermand inquisitorial commands. The psychological impact of Exterminatus extends beyond survivors and those who execute the orders to affect broader Imperial society in subtle ways. Every citizen of the Imperium lives with the knowledge that his world might face destruction at any moment if authorities deem it necessary. This creates a background anxiety that shapes behavior across billions of worlds. Populations police themselves and their neighbors, watching for signs of heresy or Xenos corruption, reporting suspicious activity to authorities because vigilance might prevent their world from requiring Exterminatus. The threat of planetary annihilation functions as the ultimate enforcement mechanism for Imperial ideology, rendering explicit authoritarian control less necessary because populations internalize behavioral expectations through fear. This system generates fascinating psychological dynamics. Citizens simultaneously believe that Exterminatus targets only worlds that have fallen beyond redemption, while fearing that their own world might face such judgment despite their faithfulness. The contradiction creates cognitive dissonance that most people resolve by intensifying their displays of loyalty and faith. If destruction comes only to those who deserve it, then demonstrating unwavering devotion to the Emperor provides protection. That this logic fails to account for the billions of faithful citizens killed during Exterminatus' actions gets ignored, because acknowledging that reality would undermine the psychological defense mechanism that makes living under constant threat bearable. The ritualized aspects of Exterminatus reinforce its ideological function. The pronouncement ceremonies, the formal orders, the liturgical elements surrounding planetary destruction all serve to sanctify what might otherwise appear as simple mass murder. When an Inquisitor declares Exterminatus, he does not order killing, but rather pronounces judgment. The world dies not through human action, but through divine will channeled through proper authority. The crews who launch the weapons become instruments of that divine will rather than perpetrators of genocide. This transformation of mass killing into religious ritual allows the Imperium to employ Exterminatus regularly without triggering moral crises among those required to carry it out. Yet for all the theological and psychological frameworks constructed to manage Exterminatus, the practice remains fundamentally horrifying to anyone who contemplates it fully. The systematic erasure of entire planetary populations The murder of billions who committed no crime beyond living on worlds that became strategically inconvenient represents evil on scales that dwarf most atrocities in human history. That the Imperium considers such actions not merely acceptable, but routine demonstrates the degree to which its survival depends on absolute ruthlessness. There can be no mercy, no hesitation, no allowing sentiment to interfere with strategic necessity. This creates a civilization where horror becomes mundane, where the systematic destruction of worlds generates less controversy than minor doctrinal disputes. The normalization of Exterminatus reflects the Imperium's broader philosophy about human life and suffering. Individual humans matter only insofar as they serve the collective survival of humanity as a species. Any number of individuals can be sacrificed if that sacrifice advances Imperial interests. This ideology treats people as infinitely renewable resources to be exploited and discarded as circumstances require. The Imperium fields armies where casualties in the millions barely merit mention in after-action reports. It operates factories where workers die from toxic exposure at rates that would trigger immediate intervention in any society valuing individual welfare. It maintains social structures where the vast majority of humanity lives in conditions of such deprivation that death often comes as relief rather than tragedy. Exterminatus simply extends this utilitarian calculus to its logical conclusion. If individual lives have value only as components of the greater imperial machine, then destroying billions of individuals becomes acceptable when those individuals inhabit a machine component that has malfunctioned beyond repair. The Imperium does not hesitate to scrap damaged equipment or burn out worn machinery. Treating human populations the same way follows naturally from the philosophical foundations underpinning Imperial ideology. This is what makes Exterminatus so uniquely horrifying within the Warhammer universe. It represents not an aberration or perversion of Imperial values, but their purest expression. The long-term psychological effects on Imperial society of normalizing planetary destruction remain difficult to assess because the Imperium lacks any external reference point for comparison. From the Imperial perspective, Exterminatus represents necessary pragmatism in a hostile galaxy where existential threats lurk constantly. But the practice shapes Imperial culture in profound ways, reinforcing the casual acceptance of mass suffering that characterizes life throughout the Imperium. When destroying entire worlds becomes acceptable, when billions of deaths generate no more controversy than demolishing a malfunctioning manufactorum, all lesser violences become trivially easy to justify. This creates a civilization where compassion itself becomes suspect, where caring about individual suffering marks someone as weak or naive. The Imperial ideology cannot permit widespread empathy, because empathy would paralyze decision-making. How could any commander order troops into battles with 90% casualty rates if he felt the full emotional weight of each death? How could any administratum official impose crushing tithes that will starve millions if he confronted the human cost of his quotas? How could any inquisitor order Exterminatus if he allowed himself to imagine the terror of billions facing annihilation? The system depends on emotional detachment, on treating people as numbers and calculations rather than as conscious beings capable of suffering. Yet even within this nightmare of institutionalized cruelty, individual humans continue experiencing the full range of emotions that define consciousness. The Imperial Guard soldier fighting his 10th campaign still feels fear and pain and grief for fallen comrades. The manufacturing worker still loves her children and mourns when disease takes them. The Hive gangers still form bonds of loyalty and friendship amid their brutal existence. The ordinary human capacity for connection and compassion persists despite systems designed to suppress it. This creates the fundamental tragedy of the Imperium. Billions of people capable of kindness, creativity, and love trapped in a civilization that demands they abandon these qualities to serve a machine that grinds them into nothing. Exterminatus crystallizes this tragedy perfectly. Every world destroyed contains not just billions of deaths, but billions of individual stories, lives with their own. Complexity and meaning reduced to statistics in after-action reports. The child playing in an underhive alley who will burn in cyclonic fire. The elderly couple spending their final years together who will dissolve into organic sludge from virus bombs. The young soldier returning from off-world service who will arrive to find his home planet a smoking ruin. The pregnant mother hoping her daughter might have better opportunities, who will never see that hope fulfilled. All these individual human experiences multiplied billions of times over, simply erased because strategic calculations deem their continued existence inconvenient. The ultimate horror of Exterminatus lies not in its scale, but in its banality. Within the Imperium, planetary destruction generates no more moral outrage than demolishing a building. The deaths of billions become paperwork to be processed, resources to be reallocated, minor disruptions to supply chains. This represents a form of evil so thorough that it has transcended evil entirely to become simple procedure. The Imperium has created systems where the greatest crimes imaginable occur constantly, carried out by ordinary people following orders, justified by ideologies that have normalized the unthinkable. And because everyone exists within this system, because no alternative framework remains available for comparison, the horror continues unchallenged generation after generation. This is the true nightmare of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Not the Xenos threats or chaos corruption that officially justify Exterminatus, but the human willingness to inflict unlimited suffering on other humans in service to abstract principles. The Imperium claims necessity drives its cruelty, that a hostile galaxy permits no mercy. But the philosophical frameworks constructed to justify Exterminatus serve primarily to make the perpetrators comfortable with their actions, rather than to demonstrate actual necessity. The system could potentially function with less horror, but such changes would require acknowledging that the current level of cruelty exceeds operational requirements. The Imperium cannot permit this acknowledgement because it would undermine the ideological foundations making the entire apparatus possible. So Exterminatus continues. Worlds burn, billions die. Survivors carry their trauma to new locations. Inquisitors sleep soundly after ordering destructions. Navy crews execute their orders professionally. Ecclesiarchy preachers sanctify the horror with religious ritual. And across the Imperium, populations live with the knowledge that their world might face the same fate tomorrow, creating a civilization where everyone exists in constant psychological siege, where the threat of total destruction maintains order more effectively than any amount of explicit enforcement could achieve. This is how empires built on horror sustain themselves, by making the horror so pervasive, so normalized, so thoroughly integrated into daily existence that imagining alternatives becomes impossible. The light died long ago, now there is only darkness, and the dying.